I've got some good news and some bad news, considerably more bad news than good news. I'll begin with the bad news and then hopefully end on a somewhat positive note. The argument in this book came to me when I was in Afghanistan and reporting on the drug trade there, the poppy economy. And the farmers would explain partly why they were growing this illegal crop and taking the risks that went along with it in terms of the crop being drought resistant. And at the time, when I first did a set of stories on that, I didn't even know that there was a drought. I later did more stories on that in other places, and that answer would always come up as part of it. And lo and behold, turns out Afghanistan is suffering the worst drought in living memory that has coincided with the whole NATO occupation there. And poppy uses 1/5 the water that wheat uses. One side in the war, the Afghan government and the NATO forces, attack poppy, typically more often in rhetoric than in actuality because there's so much corruption in the actual poppy eradication program, but there's definitely this sense of threat hanging over the farmers. And the other side, the Taliban, defends the right of the farmers to grow poppy. So along with all the religious ideas and ethnic ideology that might motivate a young man in the south of or east of Afghanistan to join up with the Taliban and fight on their side, there's this material incentive, which is that the Taliban is the side in the conflict that is defending the poor farmer's right to grow the one crop that in these drought conditions is economically feasible. And the other side is offering generally inadequate, corrupt alternative development programs based around crops that require more water and therefore aren't feasible. So this does not explain why there's a war in Afghanistan, or it's not the primary driver of the violence. But I think it's an important contributing factor in why there's an endless flow of young men willing to fight for the Taliban. And I thought there must be, I was actually writing a book about Afghanistan, and I thought, there's really a bigger book than this that I want to write, and I finally decided to go research that. And sure enough, there are other examples around the world of climate change, not in the future, somewhere down the line, leading to social breakdown, causing violence, but already right now, definitely, clearly exacerbating violent situations. So what I found in doing the research is that it's rare that climate change looks like bad weather alone. More often than not, it is expressed indirectly as ethnic violence or religious violence or banditry. And so it takes some historical research to sort of spool back the threads of causality. One of the first places I went was East Africa, and that's where the book opens. And there's a guy named Ekru Lorman, who was a Turkana pastoralist lying dead at my feet there. He had been killed the afternoon before in a cattle raid. And there's always been cattle raiding in northwest Kenya and the whole pastoralist corridor through Uganda, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, Ethiopia. But in recent years, it has become much more violent and much more intense for a number of reasons. One, there's a proliferation of cheap guns and ammunition. Two, the government has largely withdrawn from supporting nomadic populations, semi-nomadic populations, the herders in the Northwest. And now three, the region is suffering the worst drought in 60 years. So these three factors seemed to show up again and again in the reporting I was doing. And this is my idea of a catastrophic convergence, that climate change rarely just operates on its own. It arrives in the global south on a stage preset for crisis by pre-existing issues. And they are primarily the legacy of the Cold War, which has caused a proliferation of cheap weaponry, left a landscape full of bands of armed men who are proficient in the arts of smuggling and assassination and interrogation and small unit combat and asymmetrical warfare. It has also left communities that have been uprooted by war and suffer from a lack of social cohesion as a direct result of the many, many years of proxy conflicts in the global south that were part of the great ideological battle between the two camps in the Cold War, which, as you all know, in the global south was not so cold, it was quite hot, with revolutions and counterinsurgency, leaving cheap guns and a torn social fabric in many cases. And then this issue of the state withdrawing support for the populations that live with the least margin of error economically: fishermen, farmers, herders. And that's a result of neoliberal economic restructuring. The whole shift in development, reigning development ideas, beginning in the late 70s, early 80s, away from recognizing that there should be a role for the state to nurture capitalist development, build infrastructure, support different sectors of the economy according to whatever the designs of the government are, a development plan, and that is abandoned in the face of the debt crisis. And I could get into a whole specific history of that, economic history. So it's something that fascinates me, and I've returned to in numerous books. So you get out of this crisis of the post-war developmentalist Keynesian model a turn in global economic policy towards radical free market economics. And the World Bank and the IMF started imposing structural adjustment plans all across the global south, and that involves withdrawing programs for people like Ekaru Lorman to help them with different types of livestock in the face of a drought, or drilling new wells or whatever. So Ekaru Lorman found himself in a situation where there was this tremendous drought, worse in 60 years. The grazing is drying up. I mean, the acacia trees in northwest Kenya look literally like just driftwood stuck in the ground. There's, in many places, no vegetation. The herds get sick, they die. There are insufficient water holes because there isn't a program of developing water harvesting technology and building new wells. And what there is in terms of adaptive technologies at hand are cheap AK-47s that flow out of Somalia, which is a state that collapsed in 1991 as a direct result of the proxy fights between the Soviet Union and the United States. And one could have an endless debates about the details of why and how that happened, but the simple fact is that that's how Somalia collapsed, that both camps poured weaponry into this war between Ethiopia and Somalia over the Ogden region, a war that's still going on. And Said Barre, the Somali dictator, refused to give up this irredentist quest of his, and finally his army collapsed in late 1990. In January, I think it was like 4th or 5th, 91, he split the scene, and there really hasn't been a government in Somalia since. There was also momentary state collapse in Uganda. There was the war in South Sudan that has, all of these conflicts have their local origins, typically in nationalist ethnic conflicts, but then they get taken up in these grand narratives of world politics. And I won't overburden you with those details, but that's what a lot of the book is about, that specific history. So the best way to illustrate this set of dynamics and how it works differently in different places is to just go through the case studies to some extent. One place that I found very clear in how it illustrates this problem, and I think is a harbinger of how things may unfold in the future, is Kyrgyzstan. Not a country that we pay much attention to here in the United States, not tremendously important economically, but people might remember that last spring, in around April 2010, there was ethnic rioting in Kyrgyzstan between Uzbeks and Kyrgyz, and the capital, Bishkek, went up in flames. One government fell, a new government came in. That new government even requested that the Russians intervene, and the Russians very wisely declined, having had previous experience with interventions in Central Asia that didn't work out so well. And the image we got here in the newspaper was just, oh, well, ethnic hatred. But really, what the story is that the economy of Kyrgyzstan gets 90% of its electricity from hydroelectric dams, these old Soviet, particularly one old Soviet hydroelectric dam. The same drought that has been punishing Afghanistan for the last 10 years caused the water levels in that dam to reach their lowest level ever. The government then had to start rationing power. Once it starts rationing power, then industry starts shutting down, laying people off. The more people who are unemployed, the less demand there is, then the more unemployment there is. On top of this power rationing then comes one of the worst winters on record. Brutal cold, twice as cold as normal. cattle herds just literally freezing to death, the pipes in apartments exploding, people without water in this freezing cold, pensioners dying by the hundreds, industry shutting down even further, greater demand for power amidst this freezing cold, yet there's all this power rationing going on, intensified crisis. On top of that, the president then decides he wants to privatize the utilities. So to make the assets more attractive, in the early spring he announces a doubling of the electricity tariffs and promises that there will be another doubling of these. And that's when people hit the streets and they're angry and they're protesting about economic facts. But in these protests there are a lot of lumpenized young men who can't find jobs and who spend their time in these casinos, drinking and gambling and developing, you know, underworld connections and you know, a kind of hooligan culture as there is all over the world. And that element then turns these demonstrations into ethnic violence. And so you can see in that example, and the ethnic violence turns into outright pogroms. The Uzbeks were fleeing to the Uzbek border. The Uzbekistan military was sort of holding them back, kind of letting some of them in. And in the eyes of the Kyrgyz, this was payback for the Uzbeks having come in and dominated them when the Kyrgyz were poor herders and the Uzbeks were economically more developed and politically sophisticated. But so you see that underneath this ethnic conflict is an economic crisis. And underneath that economic crisis is an environmental climatological crisis, this drought and this freakishly brutal winter. And just one caveat, to be clear, climate scientists, very few climate scientists would ever ascribe causality of a specific weather event to climate change. Say, yes, Hurricane Katrina was caused by climate change, or the drought in Central Asia was caused by climate change. But what they do say is that there's this set of correlations, and there's this pattern that has been predicted for over 20 years, and it is coming to fruition, in fact, sooner than later. Sooner than had been expected. And that pattern is that burning fossil fuels creates CO2 emissions. As CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere increase, we're now at 390 parts per million. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there were about 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. As CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere increase, the temperature of the planet increases commensurately. There's an increase in the ENSO, the El Nino, La Nina, Southern Oscillation Cycle, desertification, and various weather patterns, the monsoons, the Indian Ocean monsoons fall out of sync, the intertropical convergence zone starts getting erratic and can't be counted on. This is all predicted. Various, different models have different scenarios of how it's going to go, but it's coming to pass. And so what we can say is this pattern of which these droughts and these extreme events are part is clearly, fits the pattern of the prediction of climate change. So this correlation to me suggests that we are seeing the impact of climate change. And whether or not the freak winter in Kyrgyzstan would have happened anyway if we had only 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, who knows? But